January the 17th, 1940. Warsaw, Poland. The snow fell in silence over the rubble. A German Lanzer infantryman stood in what had been a marketplace 4 months earlier, his breath misting in the frozen air. He stamped his boots against the cold, the leather cracking in the -15-degree morning. In his hands, he clutched a tin cup of ersatz coffee, chicory and acorns ground into a bitter black liquid that scalded his throat but did nothing to warm his bones. Around him, the skeletal remains of buildings jutted toward a gray sky, their windows like empty eye sockets staring back at the conquerors. The war, they had been told, would be over by Christmas. It was now mid-January, and the coffee tasted like ashes. This moment, a single soldier shivering in occupied Poland, was not the story the Reich had promised. The newsreels back home showed triumph, columns of tanks rolling through vanquished cities, flags raised over capitals, cheering crowds throwing flowers at the feet of victorious soldiers. But here, in the silence of a Polish winter, the reality was different. The war was only 4.5 months old, and already the cracks were beginning to show. Not in the grand strategy, not in the military victories, those would continue for years, but in the small, gnawing details that no propaganda film could erase. The cold, the hunger, the realization that conquest was not glory, but occupation. And occupation was not victory, but waiting. What the German soldier did not know, could not know, as he stood in that frozen marketplace, was that the war he had entered would not last months, but years. 6 years. And in those 6 years, the world would be transformed in ways that no general staff, no Führer, no emperor had anticipated. The war that began in September 1939 would become a collision not just of armies, but of ideologies, of industrial capacities, of entire ways of life. It would stretch across 6 continents, consume 70 million lives, and end with the map of the world redrawn. This is the story of those 6 years, not as a series of battles, but as a transformation. A transformation of expectations, of perceptions, of the very meaning of power. When Adolf Hitler's armies crossed into Poland on September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht was the most modern fighting force the world had ever seen. Its panzer divisions, armored spearheads supported by Stuka dive bombers and motorized infantry, embodied a new doctrine, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Polish army, still relying heavily on cavalry and static defenses, was shattered in weeks. Britain and France declared war in honor of their treaty obligations, but they did not attack. They waited. The French huddled behind the Maginot Line, a chain of fortresses along the German border that was supposed to be impregnable. The British sent a small expeditionary force to France and prepared for a long, grinding war of attrition like the one their fathers had fought from 1914 to 1918. But Hitler did not fight the last war. On April 9, 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway in a daring combined operation that stunned the Allies. Denmark fell in hours. Norway, despite British and French attempts to intervene, was conquered in 2 months. Then came the blow that shattered the illusion of Allied invincibility. On May 10, 1940, the Wehrmacht launched Fall Gelb Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Bypassing the Maginot Line, German armored columns punched through the Ardennes forest, a region the French High Command had deemed impossible for tanks. In 6 weeks, France, the great military power of Europe, the nation that had bled Germany white in the trenches of the First World War, collapsed. On June 22, 1940, in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I, Hitler forced France to sign its surrender. The German soldiers who marched through Paris that summer expected to be home by autumn. They had conquered an empire in less than a year: Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France. Only Britain remained, a stubborn island fortress across the English Channel. Surely, they thought, it was only a matter of time. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, launched a massive bombing campaign to break British morale and prepare for an invasion. But Britain did not break. Through the summer and fall of 1940, RAF pilots, many of them exhausted boys barely out of their teens, fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill in the skies over southern England. By October, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The war, it seemed, would not be over by Christmas after all. Across the world, in the Pacific, another empire was rising. Japan, an island nation with few natural resources, had been at war since 1937, locked in a brutal campaign to conquer China. The Japanese military, steeped in the code of Bushido the way of the warrior, believed in the superiority of the Japanese spirit over the materialism of the West. They had seen Western colonial powers crumble before their advance, the British in Hong Kong and Malaya, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Indochina. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In 2 hours, they sank or damaged 18 ships and destroyed nearly 200 aircraft. More than 2,000 Americans died. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies in the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. The Japanese High Command believed America was a nation of soft, materialistic individualists who would not have the stomach for a long war. They expected the Americans to negotiate after a few defeats, to accept Japanese dominance in the Pacific in exchange for peace. What they did not expect was the transformation that would occur when the United States turned its industrial might toward total war. In the spring of 1942, a Japanese naval officer stood on the deck of the carrier Akagi watching preparations for the Battle of Midway. He had been at Pearl Harbor. He had seen the American battleships burning, the black smoke rising into the perfect Hawaiian sky. He had felt the exhilaration of victory, the confirmation that the warrior spirit of Japan was superior to the decadent West. Now, 6 months later, the Akagi was part of a massive fleet sailing to capture Midway Island, a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific that the Americans used as a forward base. The plan was to lure the remnants of the American carrier fleet into a decisive battle and destroy it. With the U.S. Navy crippled, Japan would have free reign across the Pacific. But the Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes. They knew the attack was coming. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft. In 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, including the Akagi were set ablaze. The 4th was sunk later that day. Japan lost its most experienced pilots and 4 of its 6 fleet carriers. The officer who had stood on the Akagi deck went down with his ship. Midway was the turning point in the Pacific. Japan would never again launch a major offensive. What the Japanese officer did not live to understand was that the battle was not won by superior spirit, but by superior intelligence, superior logistics, and superior industrial capacity. By 1942, American shipyards were producing a new aircraft carrier every month. Japanese shipyards, starved of resources, could not replace their losses. The war had become a contest not of warrior codes, but of factories and oil wells and steel mills. And in that contest, Japan had already lost. On the Eastern Front, the largest and most brutal theater of the war, another transformation was underway. In June 1941, Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. More than 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces smashed across the Soviet border on a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By December, German forward units were within sight of the Kremlin's spires. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin, the Soviet dictator, ordered a policy of scorched earth. As the Red Army retreated, it destroyed everything that could be of use to the invaders. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, bridges blown, factories dismantled and shipped eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. And then the winter came. The coldest winter in decades. German soldiers, still wearing their summer uniforms because Hitler had expected the campaign to be over before the snow fell, froze in their foxholes. Tanks would not start. Machine guns jammed. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as Soviet bullets. Panzergrenadier a German mechanized infantryman, wrote in his diary in January 1942, "We were told the Russians were subhuman, that they would collapse at the first blow. But they keep coming. Waves of them, in their quilted jackets and fur hats, warm while we freeze. They have bread. We have frozen potatoes. Who is subhuman now?" The symbolism of bread, simple, sustaining, abundant, would echo through the German experience on the Eastern Front. In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launched a new offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. By November, German forces had penetrated deep into Stalingrad's ruins, fighting the Soviets house by house, room by room. But the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, encircling the German Sixth Army. Hitler forbade a retreat. For 3 months, the surrounded Germans fought on, their rations dwindling to a few slices of bread per day, then nothing. When the remnants of the Sixth Army finally surrendered on February 2, 1943, 91,000 starving, frostbitten men stumbled into Soviet captivity. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad was the turning point in the east. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The tide had turned. In North Africa, another German army was learning the limits of ideology in the face of logistics. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had led the Afrika Korps to stunning victories in 1941 and early 1942, driving the British back across Libya and into Egypt. But Rommel's supply lines stretched back across the Mediterranean, constantly harassed by British aircraft and submarines based in Malta. His tanks ran out of fuel. His men ran out of food. In October 1942, the British Eighth Army, reinforced and resupplied, launched a massive attack at El Alamein, 60 miles west of Alexandria. After 12 days of brutal fighting, Rommel's army broke and fled westward. It would never stop retreating. On November 8, 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa in Operation Torch *, the first major American offensive of the war. Caught between the British advancing from the east and the Americans from the west, the Afrika Korps was crushed. In May 1943, the last Axis forces in Africa surrendered, 275,000 German and Italian prisoners, more than had surrendered at Stalingrad. An American GI, landing in North Africa in the winter of 1942, wrote to his family, "The Germans we captured looked like scarecrows. Skinny, sunbound, hungry. One of them grabbed a chocolate bar from my ration and just stared at it like he'd never seen chocolate before. I gave him the whole pack. He cried. Chocolate. The small, brown symbol of American abundance. It would appear again and again in the accounts of captured German and Japanese soldiers, the shock of American rations, the sheer quantity and quality of food that even the lowest-ranking American soldier took for granted. To the Axis powers, steeped in ideologies of discipline and sacrifice, the American soldier with his pockets full of chocolate and cigarettes was an affront. How could such a soft, indulgent people possibly win a war? The answer lay not in softness, but in capacity. By 1943, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. American factories turned out a new bomber every hour, a new tank every 15 minutes, a new ship every day. The arsenal of democracy, President Roosevelt had called it, and it was a title earned in sweat and steel. Women who had never worked outside the home took jobs in shipyards and aircraft factories, riveting together the B-17s and Liberty ships that would carry the war back to the Axis homelands. African Americans, long denied full participation in American society, served with distinction in segregated units, flying P-51 Mustangs over Germany, driving tanks across France. The war was transforming America even as America transformed the war. In Europe, the air war escalated to new levels of ferocity. British and American bombers, flying in massive formations protected by swarms of fighters, pounded German cities by day and night. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Berlin, ancient cities were reduced to rubble. The objective was not just to destroy factories and railroads, but to break the will of the German people. It did not break. German war production, dispersed and driven underground, actually increased in 1944. But the Luftwaffe, bleeding pilots and aircraft in the skies over the Reich, was dying. By the spring of 1944, the Allies had achieved air supremacy over Western Europe. The road to invasion was open. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. The dawn was grey and cold. The English Channel churned with whitecaps. In the landing craft pitching toward the beach, an American infantryman gripped his rifle and tried not to vomit. Around him, other men prayed, or stared at nothing, or checked their equipment for the 100th time. The naval bombardment had been going on for an hour, the heavy shells screaming overhead and exploding on the bluffs above the beach. Surely, the soldier thought, nothing could survive that. Surely the Germans were dead or stunned or running. The ramp dropped. Machine gun fire ripped through the men in the front ranks before they could take a step. The soldier lunged into the water, chest deep and shockingly cold, and waded toward the beach through a surf-stained red. Mortars exploded. Artillery shells plowed furrows in the sand. Bodies floated face down in the shallows. He made it to the shingle, a narrow strip of stones at the base of the bluff, and pressed himself flat, gasping. All around him, men were dying. Medics dragged wounded soldiers behind beach obstacles. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of explosions. For a moment, it seemed the invasion might fail. But slowly, in small groups, men began to move. A sergeant led a squad up a gully, blowing a hole in the German wire with a Bangalore torpedo. A lieutenant rallied a platoon and stormed a machine gun nest. Inch by inch, yard by yard, the Americans clawed their way up the bluffs. By nightfall, they held the high ground. The cost was staggering, more than 2,000 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone. But the invasion succeeded. By the end of June, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in France. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. As the Allies advanced from the west, the Red Army steamrolled from the east. In the summer of 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration*, a massive offensive that shattered the German Army Group Center and liberated Belarus. The Wehrmacht, bled white by 3 years of fighting in the east, could no longer hold. By January 1945, the Red Army was crossing into Germany itself. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing after 12. A German civilian, fleeing westward ahead of the Soviet advance, later recalled, "We had been told the Soviets were barbarians, subhuman Asiatic hordes. But it was our army that had burned their villages, starved their cities, murdered their people. Now they were coming for revenge, and we had no right to be surprised." In the Pacific, American forces advanced island by island toward Japan. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was a bloodbath, the Japanese defenders fighting to the death with a ferocity born of desperation and ideology. On Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, more than 12,000 Americans died, and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. The closer the Americans came to the Japanese home islands, the more savage the fighting became. American planners estimated that an invasion of Japan itself might cost 1 million Allied casualties and millions of Japanese dead. But on August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, a uranium-based atomic weapon nicknamed Little Boy, exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The city center was vaporized. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks and months that followed, from burns and radiation sickness. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese had ever heard his voice. A Japanese soldier, interned in a POW camp in the Philippines, heard the news and wept. Not from grief, but from exhaustion. "I believed we would fight to the last man," he said later. "I believed death was preferable to surrender. But when I heard the emperor's voice, I felt only relief. The war was over. I could stop pretending I wanted to die." May 8, 1945. Berlin. The city was a ruin. Soviet artillery had pounded the Reich Chancellery to rubble. Red Army soldiers, drunk on looted schnapps and triumph, fired their rifles into the air. The swastika was torn down from the Reichstag and replaced with the red banner of the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler was dead, a suicide in his bunker as the Red Army closed in. In his last will and testament, he blamed the German people for failing him, for not being hard enough, strong enough, worthy enough of his vision. But the German people, starving in the ruins of their cities, did not mourn him. They mourned their sons, their fathers, their homes. The war in Europe was over. 3 months later, the war in Asia ended. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, looked out over the assembled officers and said, "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge." The world that emerged was not the one anyone had expected when the war began in 1939. Europe was in ruins, its great empires shattered. Britain and France, though technically victorious, were exhausted and bankrupt. The Soviet Union, despite its 27 million dead, had emerged as a superpower, its armies occupying Eastern Europe. The United States, untouched by invasion and enriched by wartime production, was the only nation with atomic weapons, the only nation capable of projecting power across the globe. The world had been divided into 2 camps, communist and capitalist, and the Cold War, a conflict that would define the next half-century, had already begun. But the most profound transformation was not geopolitical. It was ideological. The war had been fought, in the end, not just between nations, but between visions of what humanity could be. The Axis powers had believed in hierarchy, in the superiority of certain races and nations, in the glorification of the state and the warrior. The Allies, for all their flaws and contradictions, had fought for something different. For democracy, however imperfect, for freedom, however incomplete, for the idea that ordinary people had the right to live their lives without bowing to tyrants. The German soldier in Warsaw, the Japanese officer on the Akagi*, the Panzergrenadier freezing at Stalingrad, they had all believed in the ideologies they fought for. They had expected triumph, glory, vindication. What they experienced instead was cold, hunger, defeat. And in the end, it was not the strength of their convictions that determined the outcome, but the strength of their enemies' factories. The chocolate bar in the American ration pack, the Soviet loaf of bread, the endless stream of ships and tanks and planes, these were the symbols of a different kind of power. Not the power of the warrior spirit, but the power of abundance, of democracy, of a system that could mobilize not just armies, but entire peoples. The war had lasted 6 years. It had killed more than 70 million people, soldiers and civilians, men and women, old and young. It had destroyed cities, toppled empires, redrawn borders. It had revealed the depths of human cruelty in the Holocaust, the slaughter of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed unworthy by the Nazi regime. It had revealed, too, the heights of human courage, the resistance fighters who risked torture and death, the soldiers who stormed beaches and held the line, the ordinary people who hid refugees, who shared their food, who refused to surrender their humanity even in the darkest hours. And when it was over, the survivors looked at the ruins and asked themselves, what now? The answer, slowly and imperfectly, began to take shape. The United Nations was founded, a flawed but necessary attempt to prevent another world war. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe, turning former enemies into allies. Japan, occupied and reformed, became a democracy and an economic powerhouse. The world, scarred and exhausted, began to heal. But the memory remained. The memory of what ideology, taken to its extreme, could do. The memory of what it cost to stop it. The memory of the small things, the chocolate bar, the loaf of bread, the cup of Ersatzcoffee, that revealed the truth beneath the slogans and the propaganda. The truth that abundance is not weakness. That democracy, for all its messiness, is stronger than tyranny. That the power to create is greater than the power to destroy. 70 years later, the last veterans of World War II are passing. Their voices fade, their stories become history. But the lesson they paid for with their blood and their suffering endures. Freedom is not free. Democracy is not guaranteed. Abundance is not automatic. These things must be built, defended, renewed in every generation. The war that began in the cold streets of Warsaw, that raged across 6 continents in 6 years, that consumed nations and remade the world, it was not just a clash of armies. It was a test of ideas. And in the end, the ideas that won were not those of the warrior elite, but those of the ordinary people who believed, however imperfectly, in a world where everyone had enough. Enough food, enough freedom, enough hope. That was the victory. That is the legacy. And that is the truth the soldiers in the ruins discovered, one chocolate bar, one loaf of bread, one frozen morning at a time. The snow still falls in winter over the places where they fought. But the cities have been rebuilt. The borders have been redrawn. The children and grandchildren of enemies play together. And in the quiet moments, if you listen, you can almost hear the echo of their lesson, carried on the wind across the decades, that the greatest power is not the power to conquer, but the power to endure. Not the power to dominate, but the power to share. Not the ideology of the few, but the abundance of the many. That is what World War II taught the world. That is what those 6 years, those 70 million lives, bought for us. And that is what we must never forget.